Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready to dive in. This time we are tackling the September issue of OCQ magazine.
Edition 41.
That's right, number 41. And this one really caught my eye because it's all about vitality in the workplace.
Yeah.
Which, let's be honest, we could all use a little more of that, right?
Okay.
Especially these days, huh? And they're not messing around. We're talking a deep dive into what vitality actually means, not just like, putting a plant on your desk and calling it a day.
It's more than just a buzzword in this issue.
So for anyone who hasn't had a chance to flip through it yet, what's the main takeaway? What's the big idea they're exploring?
Well, they're really making the case that vitality is not just some fluffy perk. It's actually crucial for a company's bottom line.
Okay, I like where this is going.
Yeah, and they've got the research to back it up.
Oh, they always do. They're really good at pulling in those studies.
You really are.
So break it down for us. How do they connect those dots? How does employee well-being translate into like cold, hard cash for companies?
Well, they talk about how vitality, or lack thereof, directly impacts things like productivity, employee retention, even a company's public image. Like, if you're known as a burnout factory, it's not good for attracting top talent.
No, not at all. Nobody wants to work for the company that's notorious for like chewing people up and spitting them out. People talk.
They do. Word gets around.
Exactly. So, okay, back to this idea of vitality, though. We've tossed the word around a bit, but what does it actually look like in practice, according to OCQ?
So they don't just leave it as this vague idea. They actually break it down into 4 key areas: physical, mental, social, emotional, and even spiritual.
Oh, wow. They're really covering all the bases, huh?
They are. It's really about that feeling of being energized and engaged in all areas of your life. And here's the thing. Work being a part of that, not a drain on it.
Yeah, I like that. It's about like work-life harmony, not necessarily like this perfect balance, which, let's be real, is kind of a myth.
Totally. And I think that's what makes this issue so relevant.
Okay, so let's say you're a business leader listening to this. You're intrigued by this idea of vitality, but you might be thinking, okay, but why should I prioritize this? Why should I care? Aside from, being a decent human being.
Right. Well, OCQ makes it clear that investing in employee well-being isn't just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
I was going to say, get those wallets ready, folks, because we're about to talk return on investment.
Exactly. This issue highlights the very real impact of investing in vitality, leading to happier, healthier employees who are more engaged and less likely to jump ship. They even quantify it.
Hit me with those numbers.
Citing research that shows companies with strong vitality initiatives have seen significant reductions in employee turnover, some by as much as 65%.
65%. Okay, now that's a stat to bring to the boardroom.
Right.
Like, if that doesn't get a CEO's attention, I don't know what will.
Yeah.
But I have to ask, how do you even begin to measure something as intangible as vitality? You can't exactly, put it under a microscope.
That's the thing, right? It's not like measuring profits or website clicks. But OCQ, they propose a multidimensional approach.
Multidimensional, I like it. Sounds very official.
Right. Think of it as a combination of hard data, like sick leave numbers and productivity metrics, mixed with qualitative feedback, like employee surveys and even one-on-one interviews.
So it's about getting the full picture?
Exactly.
Right.
Because numbers tell one story, but to really understand how your employees are feeling, you've got to dig a little deeper.
It's like they always say in those detective shows, right? Go to the source.
Exactly.
So not just checking boxes, but actually creating a workplace where people can genuinely thrive.
Precisely. It's about using that data, both the numbers and the stories behind them, to actually inform company culture and create an environment that truly supports employees' well-being in all its forms.
In all its form, yeah.
And that's where it gets really interesting.
Because then it becomes not just about, Wellness Wednesdays or whatever. It's about something much more holistic and sustainable.
Okay, so we've got this foundation now. We understand what's at stake, why vitality matters, both for individuals and for businesses. But how do we actually get there? How do we make this a reality?
Well, that's where things get really interesting.
Let's dig in. Speaking of creating a workplace where people can thrive, this issue had some really interesting articles on leadership. And I feel like this is where the rubber really meets the road.
Absolutely, because you can have all these great ideas about vitality,
right?
But if the people at the top aren't on board,
forget it.
It's going to fall flat. Exactly. So there are 3 articles in particular I wanted to get your take on. First up, we've got Nancy Cabalt-Groot.
Oh, interesting.
making a pretty bold case for mandatory women's quotas in leadership positions.
Yeah, that's a hot topic for sure.
It is, and her article doesn't shy away from it. In fact, she uses this really striking historical example
Oh,
about the Dutch post office
right.
back in the 1920s. And get this, they actually had legal limits on how many women they would employ.
Wow, I did not know that.
Yeah, apparently they thought it was like disrupting the natural order of things or something.
It's amazing how these things like echo through history, isn't it?
It really is. Makes you wonder how far we've actually come sometimes, right? But anyway, so Cabal Groot uses this example to really drive home her point that sometimes you need those hard legal requirements, you know?
Those lines in the sand.
Exactly. With real consequences for companies that don't meet them. Otherwise, nothing changes.
It's that whole idea of what gets measured gets managed.
Yes. And I have to say, that part of her argument really resonated with me. Like, on the one hand, quotas can feel a little, I don't know, like a blunt instrument.
Sure.
But on the other hand, if it gets results...
Right, you have to look at the outcomes.
And her point about how those quotas could then have this like ripple effect, eventually influencing all levels of a company.
It's like a shift in the whole ecosystem.
Exactly. So I'm curious to hear your take on this. Is a quota really the only way to achieve that kind of systemic change?
You know, it's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't know if there's an easy answer.
Right.
Because Cabal Groot makes a really compelling argument. And her research is solid. But it is a really complex issue with valid arguments on both sides.
Absolutely. And I think it's something that more business leaders need to be like actively discussing and debating, you know?
100%.
Because the status quo is obviously not working.
No.
So we need to be open to new approaches, even if they make us a little uncomfortable.
Forcing us to really examine those long-held assumptions.
Exactly. Okay, so shifting gears here a bit, we also have this fascinating AI-generated piece in this issue on the role of leadership in a vital organization.
Oh, I was curious about that one. How did the AI approach something as, well, human as leadership?
Right. You'd think that would be a tough one for an algorithm to crack, but honestly, it was surprisingly insightful.
Really?
Yeah, though it definitely leaned heavily on the, like, inspirational quotes and feel-good advice.
So, like, a LinkedIn influencer,
Yeah.
but AI-powered.
Pretty much. But there were some real nuggets of wisdom in there. Like, one thing the AI emphasized was the importance of active listening.
Which, let's be honest, is something a lot of leaders could stand to improve on.
Truth. And it wasn't just about, like, the mechanics of listening, but about really creating a culture of open communication and feedback.
Where employees feel heard and valued.
Yes. And that takes conscious effort, you know? It doesn't just happen by accident.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
It's about creating that space for those conversations to happen organically.
Exactly. And the AI also talked about the importance of continuous learning, both for the leader and for the team as a whole.
Because the world's not standing still, so why should we?
Right. Like that whole
Right.
growth mindset thing.
Yes, you've got to stay curious, stay adaptable, otherwise you're going to get left behind.
Especially in today's rapidly changing world. But I think the thing that struck me the most was the AI's emphasis on leading by example.
Because you can talk the talk,
All day long.
but if you're not walking the walk,
It's meaningless, right?
totally. And that's where I think the human element of leadership still reigns supreme.
It's about embodying those values, even when it's hard.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's something an AI can't quite replicate, at least not yet.
Maybe not yet. Give it another couple of software updates.
Right. But in all seriousness, I think that's a really important point. Because it's one thing for an AI to spit out buzzwords like empowerment and open communication,
Right.
but actually putting those into practice within the complexities of real-life company culture, that's a whole other ball game.
It's messy, right? Because we're humans and we bring all our baggage and our quirks and our, like, you know.
Well, there are deadlines and our budgets and
Exactly. All that stuff. So how do you take these, like, idealistic principles and actually make them work in the real world?
well, that's where I think good leadership comes in.
That's where the magic happens.
It's that art of taking those high-level concepts and figuring out how to make them relevant and actionable.
And then, you know, actually doing it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's something, at least for now, we still need humans for.
Maybe someday we'll have AI CEOs.
Who knows? Maybe they'll do a better job than us.
I mean, they probably wouldn't sleep on the job, right?
True. No more 3 a.m. emails.
Okay, so we've covered women in leadership, AI leadership, but there's one more article we have to talk about.
Okay, hit me with it.
This one's a bit different. It's actually an ad.
An ad.
I know, but hear me out because it's from the Taoist Health Institute.
Interesting.
And they're making this really bold claim about reducing sick leave
Okay.
to a mere 2 months a year.
2 months?
I know.
That's almost unheard of.
Right. Like, what company wouldn't want that?
Exactly. But it does make you wonder, what's the catch?
Right. Because 2 months, that's like a dream.
It is.
Yeah.
And, maybe we should take it with a grain of salt.
Sure.
But even if we're skeptical, it does raise some interesting questions.
Like what?
Well, for starters, are we overlooking alternative approaches to employee well-being?
I mean, we are talking about ancient wisdom here.
Exactly. And this ad really emphasizes the Taoist focus on a holistic approach, looking at both physical and mental health, which, if you think about it, aligns with OCQ's broader definition of vitality.
It all comes back around full circle, doesn't it?
It does, and I think that's what I appreciate about this issue. It's not just giving us one answer. It's encouraging us to look at this from multiple angles.
To think outside the box, even.
Exactly, and maybe even outside our comfort zones a little bit.
Because who knows, maybe a little Taoism is what our workplaces have been missing all along.
Right. Maybe the secret to a thriving company isn't in the latest productivity hack, but in some ancient wisdom.
Maybe we've been looking for the answers in the wrong places all along.
It's entirely possible.
Speaking of looking for answers in unexpected places, this issue has a fantastic interview with Kiki Kemp.
Oh, I love her work.
Right. She's been featured in OCQ quite a bit.
She has. Her stuff on pain treatment is always so insightful.
It is, and she has such a unique way of approaching it. It's not just about addressing the physical symptom.
Right, it's that mind-body connection she always talks about.
Exactly. And this interview was really interesting because it was kind of a year in review, looking back on all her articles from the past year.
Oh, cool.
Yep.
So like a greatest hits collection of her wisdom.
Exactly. And one of the things that really stood out to me was her emphasis on self-compassion.
Self-compassion.
Yeah.
You don't hear that word thrown around a lot, especially in a work context.
Right. It's like we're supposed to be these productivity machines, always on, always hustling.
Yeah, like who has time for feelings?
Right. But Kemp makes a really compelling case for why self-compassion is so important, especially in today's work environment.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
So how does she connect those dots?
Well, she talks about how, we're constantly bombarded with these messages about hustle culture and crushing it.
Now tell me about it.
And it's like we're all just supposed to push ourselves to the limit all the time.
Which, let's be real, is not sustainable.
Exactly. And it takes a toll, both physically and mentally.
It's like that saying, you can't pour from an empty cup.
Yes. And I think that's what I appreciate about Kemp's approach. She's not afraid to say, hey, it's okay to not be okay sometimes.
It's like giving yourself permission to be human.
Exactly. And she even offers some really practical techniques for cultivating more self-compassion in our lives. One thing she talked about was the importance of recognizing and challenging those negative thought patterns.
Oh, you mean that little voice in your head that's always telling you you're not good enough?
Yes.
The one that tells you should be working harder, doing more?
Ugh, I know that voice all too well.
Right. But Kemp's point is that we don't have to listen to that voice.
We can choose to challenge it.
Exactly. And she even suggests literally scheduling time for self-care, even if it's just for a few minutes each day.
Because if it's not on the calendar, it's not real, right?
Exactly. And she's not talking about a spa day necessarily.
Right.
Just those little things that help you recharge and reconnect with yourself.
Whether it's going for a walk, reading a book, or just sitting quietly for 5 minutes and taking some deep breaths.
Exactly. Whatever fills your cup. Because when you're feeling depleted, you're not doing your best work anyway.
Exactly. And you're certainly not bringing your most vital self to the table.
Right. So self-compassion isn't selfish.
It's an investment.
Exactly. In yourself and in your work.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into OCQ's September issue, all about vitality.
So much good stuff to unpack.
I know, right? What are some key takeaways our listeners can, put into action in their own lives, whether they're, leading a company or just trying to survive another Monday morning?
Well, I think the biggest thing is this idea that vitality is not just some fluffy perk.
Right.
It's essential. It's fundamental, both for individual well-being and for organizational success.
And it's not just about ping pong tables and free snacks.
Although those are nice perks.
They don't hurt.
But it's about creating a culture that values and supports well-being in all its forms.
Physical, mental, emotional.
Even spiritual. Remember that ad from the Taoist Health Institute?
Oh, yeah. Ancient wisdom for the modern workplace.
Exactly. And I think that's what I appreciate about this issue. It's encouraging us to think outside the box when it comes to vitality.
To be open to new ideas. even if they
But
seem a little out there at first.
because you never know what might work.
Exactly. And as Kiki Kemp reminds us, it's a journey, not a destination.
So true. It's about those small, consistent steps we take each day to move toward the more vital version of ourselves.
Well said. This issue of OCQ gave us a lot to think about. What about you, listeners? What's one small step you can take today to inject a little more vitality into your life? Food for thought. And don't forget, next month's edition of OCQ drops on the 15th, and you can always find more content on their website, www.oc-q.com. Until next time, stay vital.